I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Understanding Nearshoring and Its Benefits. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Collaborative Consulting. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about a few tools that you'll be able to use throughout today's session. First, we encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. During today's presentation, we'll be asking a poll question to get to know you better and to help ensure that the content is relevant to your specific needs. When the poll appears, be sure to select the answer that best fits the question. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. Now I'd like to say a few words about the Outsourcing Institute. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. OI specializes in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you who market into this space, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this area. Our contact information is on the bottom of the screen for those of you who have any questions. I'd like to share with you a couple of upcoming events that OI is planning. First, we have the Outsourcing Institute Fall Roadshow focusing on outsourcing governance and relationship management. The Roadshow event will be held on December 5th in New York City. We are also planning the Wall Street Tech Conference show on March 13th of 2013, and we'll be covering what's known as T5, which includes sourcing, cloud computing, big data, mobility, security, and compliance. If you're planning to be in New York City during these times, we hope you can join us. To find out more details, please visit us at outsourcing.com. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator and subject matter expert joining today's webinar, Amrita Joshi. Amrita is the CEO of Ahelia, a marketing consulting firm focused on the global IT services industry. Amrita and her firm have done a significant amount of work in the global sourcing space, from conducting research on the potential of domestic sourcing to location assessments and helping promote domestic service providers. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to Amrita. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. I would like to go ahead and introduce our other speaker, John Williams. John Williams is the Senior Vice President of Services at Collaborative Consulting. He sets the services strategy at Collaborative and is leading their Domestic Solution Center strategy. Okay. And with that, today's webinar, here's the agenda for today. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about an introduction to domestic sourcing, some of the high-level benefits and challenges, as well as how to think about domestic sourcing as part of your global delivery strategy. John is going to then take over and go into a little bit more detail on really the current trends in domestic sourcing, but really the value proposition, more details, specific models that you can look at, success factors, and really kind of how to prove the business value and how to look at domestic sourcing as more than just kind of business value, its impact here in the United States. So with that, I will get started. Okay. So what is domestic sourcing? And the title of this webinar is Onshoring, but as you see, there's a variety, no shortage of names for domestic sourcing. And really, how we define it in our work that we've done is that, outsourcing or insourcing is to lower cost metropolitan or rural areas that provide significant benefits over tier 1 metropolitan cities, or offshoring. And so they are a different type of benefit, but that's kind of how we define it. And you'll hear all of these terms being used to describe what we're talking about today, which is domestic sourcing. So really, is domestic sourcing new? I mean, we've had outsourcing going on in the United States, since the industrial age. So really, is it something new, or why is it that people are talking about it today? Well, we say somewhat it is, and that's because kind of the model is changing for domestic sourcing. So prior to global sourcing or offshoring, I'd say in the late 1990s, before it took off, or early 2000s, really people in the United States, when you outsourced primarily for skills and capabilities and risk reduction. You really outsourced to other companies that could do something better than you could. It wasn't about cost savings. And, if you guys all remember the big days of where very, very large-scale deals were outsourced to companies like EDS and IBM and IT because they were really more experienced to manage infrastructure. Well, when global sourcing took off, U.S. companies, I won't necessarily even say domestic outsourcing, but U.S. companies that did focus on outsourcing really, took had to adjust in 3 ways. One, they either developed an offshore option for their clients, and obviously a lot of the tier 1 and tier 2 players did that. A lot of the smaller companies really just did focus on niche high-end skills or staff augmentation. And then, of course, there's a bunch of companies that do focus on regulated industries. And that's really what happened after the offshoring boom in the early 2000s to U.S. companies. So now, but the main thing is that domestic companies really did not reinvent themselves to achieve a low-cost objective at home. That really didn't start happening, I think, when I say a larger scale way, until kind of the last 5 years, where people very seriously looked at the model of domestic sourcing and how they can actually achieve a lower cost objectives from the United States. So if you look at the traditional drivers for domestic sourcing, and when I do say traditional, I am just talking about maybe, the early 2000s when people started kind of thinking about this. Really, people were looking at the negatives of offshoring. That was the value proposition. It's, how can we show an alternative, because there are these negatives of offshoring, and that was really the primary value proposition. And this was also fueled by economic downturns. Domestic sourcing does tend to get a lot more attention during economic downturns and, of course, election times. And so it was. So these were kind of what's driven the conversation. I would say that the 2009, as the recession happened, it actually was a little bit more productive in the sense that I think there was really more real fear. There was a more proactive and positive approach to, this is not just about being pro-American or anti-offshoring, let me put it that way, but really that we have to think about our competitiveness as a country in the long term. And so you started to see a lot more kind of productive conversations about really how to keep technology innovation in the United States that was centered around this recession. So today's drivers for domestic sourcing, how is it different? One is really the general economic environment. Of course, we do have high unemployment. It is, of course, better now and getting better. The wage deflation, and again, this kind of overall concern that there is a more permanent shift in American competitiveness. And I think a lot of people who didn't look at domestic sourcing before are starting to look at it. Economic downturns. So when there are economic downturns, people, of course, have reduced IT investment. There are smaller and fewer projects, smaller projects, and people do, one of the first things to get slashed, as we all know, in companies is travel. And so all of these factors actually do help to promote doing more work at home. Offshore engagements do take a higher investment, upfront investment. Obviously, it's a high travel, and they usually tend to only make sense when you're doing very large-scale projects. So that also helped. It has helped drive domestic sourcing in the last few years. And then really we have some fundamental shifts in business dynamics going on in IT and technology. We have very reduced product life cycles, much tighter turnaround times, of course a big focus on agile development. There is a very big focus on cost reduction, and there's a lot of new IT options that are actually reducing the cost of software, cloud, SaaS, etc. And all of these kind of fuel a more agile development cycle, which can be done, much easier in a domestic model than in an offshore remote model. So benefits and challenges. John is going to be talking a lot about this, so I am going to go very high level, and he's going to give some more detail. But domestic sourcing can generate cost savings, and it is more than labor arbitrage. I'll just talk about one point that I think sometimes people don't think about, is that a lot of times for projects that have a high level of interaction or potentially a high level of on-site required, if you have a domestic source, if you are outsourcing domestically, you actually can reduce that on-site and off-site ratio quite significantly for some of those projects. People don't necessarily have to be on site. They just need to be close to be able to come to meetings, etc. And so you can see a lot of projects, that are, for example, ERP implementations that tend to be 50-50 on-site offshore, can actually be reduced we saw a case of 70-25 because the outsourcing location was close enough. And so there's a cost savings just on having people on site at your location. So Arlene, I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. And then, there are other very important benefits. Of course, ease of doing business, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. Less risk. And when we talk about less risk, there's actually less cost to mitigating this risk as well. So that's something to remember. I think one of the major benefits is speed to market. Usually can have a much tighter business to IT alignment. The proximity helps in feedback loops, and of course the understanding of U.S. business requirements, etc. And then one thing in our research that really did come up when companies were choosing locations was business development opportunities. We did have some companies that really chose their location. They were able to actually get opportunities in terms with local and state governments in that area, and that was a big positive for them. Okay. So some of the challenges, when we talk about low-cost domestic sourcing, we usually are talking outside of Tier 1 and Tier 2. And if you look at kind of the Tier 3 and 4 locations, probably the biggest challenge is scalability, and especially in IT. And so, if you are looking at a 1,000-person IT center, a Tier 3 or rural area may not, it's not going to have that for you. So you do have to look carefully at the size of engagement that you're looking at. Breadth of skill sets also can be an issue in Tier 3 and Tier 4. Lack of business ecosystem, so other businesses that are going to help support you there. And another one which came up a lot was kind of availability of the appropriate real estate. Companies in the U.S., service companies, do not want to build out usually their buildings. Most of them would like to have that ready, and therefore a lot of times the choice of location can actually come down to the choice of the building. Okay. So I'm going to just finish up a couple slides on domestic sourcing strategy, and really, how you incorporate domestic sourcing into your overall global strategy could be, is a topic in itself. But I'll try to touch a little bit about, for those of you who have larger global strategies, global sourcing strategies, how does domestic sourcing fit in, or how can you fit that in? Well, one, on the cost savings, we'll put it out there as ranging from 15 to 30% compared to Tier 1 metropolitan cities. So you can have that kind of idea in mind when you're putting together your business case. When you look at scale, definitely something to keep in mind. When you are looking at tier one, when you're looking at tier rural areas, you're looking at about 50 to 100 person centers for rural areas and 100 to 200 for maybe tier 2, tier 3. And we've seen as much as I think we've seen 300 or 400 in a very rural area. So these are just kind of guidelines for what is on average you think that you'd be able to scale up to in these places. Of course, BPO is much higher with going to seeing 100 to 200 in rural areas and 200 to 500 in kind of tier 2, tier 3 cities. So your role within global strategy, I think the thing that everybody thought about first is having it very complementary to nearshore, offshore, and then as well as engagements with high % of on-site requirements, which I touched upon before, and any short engagements that really require very quick turnaround are usually very well done here in the States. When you look at scope of services, we're looking at very kind of specialized IT, where speed is very important and a high degree of interaction. If you look at the domestic sourcing companies, they are usually very strong in agile software development, so projects that require agile development. Of course, on the BPO side, you look at cultural context, regulated industries, transactional versus judgment-based. The other thing we're seeing a lot of companies do is that sometimes when you're offshore, the offshoring firms will tend to be specialists. And they will tend to do a large amount of, or a breadth of services when you have a very large large outsourcing project to give them. But if you don't, and you have a variety of things, such as some IT, some call centers, some business process, many times a vendor in the United States can handle that type of variety at a much smaller scale. And then it's also projects that require mid-level to senior IT talent. We all know that the offshore model has is a large pyramid with a lot of junior people, and when a project is not going to work or not work well for that model, and you need mid to senior people, domestic sourcing can be a very, very good alternative. And I see I'm running on time, so let me just really quickly go over this slide just to show you an example. We did a project in North Texas looking at a few communities in North Texas and their appropriateness to really expand their domestic sourcing in those locations. And we were able to extrapolate, Grayson was kind of what we'd call a tier 3 city. Fannin was a rural community of 10,000 people. And we were kind of we were able to kind of extrapolate that this is very similar to what other cities would be of similar characteristics. And you can see here that, in cities like Grayson, which was more of a tier 3 cities, IT could be supported. It was low to mid-level, most of the resources, but some high level. And it would be definitely appropriate for some mid-level to larger BPO and some kind of lower-level ITO. Fannin, on the other hand, is only appropriate for the BPO side because the technical skill sets were really difficult to find. And so this kind of just gives you kind of an overview as you're looking at different locations, which John is going to talk a lot more about. Okay, so now before handing it over to John, we're actually going to have we have one polling question for the audience. So Arlene. Okay, I will read out. So the question really is are you considering a domestic sourcing as part of your IT strategy? So very simple polling question. Having you, if you guys can go ahead and answer that. We'll give a few seconds for everyone to take the poll.
I'll close the poll in 10 seconds.
Okay, so we have a very appropriate audience, of course, for this webinar. So that is really interesting. So we have about 72% of the people who said they are considering a domestic sourcing strategy. So, John, does that surprise you? Is that in line with what you're seeing?
You know, if you asked this question 6 months ago, I'd say this is surprising, but the more that we see this market, the more we see a growing interest and awareness. So, no, it actually doesn't surprise me. Certainly not from an audience that's sort of driven out of the Outsourcing Institute, where they really have a lot of keen insight and think a lot about, you know, how they best source their IT strategy. So.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for participating in that. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to John, who's going to continue the discussion by talking about some trends in domestic sourcing.
Great. Thank you very much, Amrita. We're certainly very excited to be participating in this webinar. We, as a firm, really strongly believe that this is an option that we should, as a company and I think as an industry, be more and more focused on as not necessarily an alternative, but an adjunct to the ways we deliver service and the way we consume services in today's IT market space. And Amrita spoke about some of these metrics, so I'll only go over the things that I think are a little more informative beyond what she was able to share with us, give a little bit more detail. But it certainly is a trend that we've seen significant growth in over the past few years. I would say going back about 3 to 5 years, we've seen substantial interest in this marketplace, and in the past year or so, there's been a huge uptick, perhaps driven by our political climate, perhaps other factors, in entrance into the market. Last analysis we did, we saw no fewer than 20 U.S.-based domestic sourcing companies or companies with a significant message in the domestic sourcing space. That's way up from trends prior to that. The Forrester Research actually recently stated that they see no less than 100% growth in 2013 over 2012 of this market in terms of revenue dollars driven out of this marketplace. And both Forrester and Gartner have picked up significant coverage in this space. And usually when the analyst firms start making noise about it, it's at least at the beginning of the life cycle, if not, you know, moving up the visibility stack. Almost every major IT solutions provider has some form of ITO that they're considering a domestic sourcing solution. And that also includes a lot of the major India offshore firms. They're all looking at opportunities to create domestic sourcing within the U.S. And centers more local to their clients. General Motors recently was quoted as stating not only are they intending to bring in their IT organization back to General Motors proper, so make it employees versus having it outsourced, they intend to do it in the United States. Huge sea change for a company like General Motors, which has a large percentage of their IT resources now offshore, to not only bring it back in-house, but also bring it back to the U.S. And many other U.S. companies, a lot of them we speak to every day, are looking at this as part of their strategy, part of their portfolio. And judging by our audience here, it was 72% or so at least considering it. I'd say that there's a large portion of the audience that's also thinking about it as well. It has been driven certainly by high U.S. unemployment levels, which have driven down the cost of U.S. resources. So the opportunity in the United States, which has not really existed prior because of the cost, costs are becoming more and more in line, and I think that's fueling the trend. One of the challenges, though, still remains because for the last several years we have focused so heavily on offshoring of IT services as a way to drive down our costs that you really need to start thinking about what is the value proposition and why would you do things in a domestic solution center versus an offshore solution center. And so we wanted to put together some items to think about. And I know Amrita actually covered a lot of these, so we're going to talk about them at a high level and then talk about some metrics to begin to consider. If you look at the cost of labor today in a domestic solution center that's not in a major metropolitan area is certainly significantly lower than major metropolitan area costs. But it's still higher than offshore. Depending on the marketplace you're in, it still can be 1.5 to 2 times as high. So you cannot develop the entire value proposition on cost of labor per hour alone. There have to be other factors. One of the keys, and Amrita also mentioned this, is resource mix. There is significant evidence that you can use a much more heavily off-site resource pool if you do a domestic solution versus an offshore solution. And a large percentage of the reason for that is because it is easier to communicate and collaborate if the resources are remotely located but within the same time zone or within 1 or 2 time zones from the primary location. The increase in availability of communication, video chat, etc., makes it feel much more like you're in the same room or same location, even if you're off-site. So therefore, you don't have to be as dependent on on-site physical presence. You can have more of those resources off-site. That's a lot harder when you're a significant number of time zones away and have language barriers and communication barriers in between the 2 locations. There's also an additional internal benefit when you look at the amount of effort that your people in IT have to expend on a domestic solution versus an off-site solution. It's much more akin to a local solution. So if you're in the same facility, the additional amount of work that you have to put into it, attending meetings that are off hours, or communicated in a more detailed fashion, or giving more clear and complete direction, it's a much simpler environment to work in when you're looking at domestic sourcing. Because of a lot of those factors, the rework is lower. So a lot of the impact of offshore that we've seen is that because of the communication gap and communication time lag, oftentimes you end up having to do rework on the end product because the communication just was not clear or complete enough. So there's significantly less rework that we've experienced in the domestic model versus the offshore model. Also, the turnover is much different. The metrics that we've seen recently, matter of fact, I think we picked up some metrics from Forbes magazine just recently, say that there's up to 50% turnover in a lot of the high-growth offshore locations. U.S. turnover in a domestic, well-chosen domestic location is more like 5 to 10%. And turnover, as everybody who does IT work knows, is a key factor in slowing down IT work because of the learning curve that you have to come up if you're a new resource entering into an already ongoing project. So turnover inefficiency is a huge win for domestic sourcing because typically the turnover is much lower. And a lot of that's driven, by the way, by the income level discrepancies between the 2 as far as income growth. So offshore locations are still growing pretty rapidly when it comes to the increase in available income. So changing jobs can have a significant boost to someone's primary income, whereas in the U.S., income is very stabilized. And so changing jobs within a location, a well-chosen location, doesn't gain as much financial benefit for someone. Also, if you choose the right location, you can manage that potential by choosing a location where your center is a preferred provider, so there's not as many options to do job changing. We'll talk about that in a later slide. In addition, travel cost can be significantly different if you're talking about a location that is nearby versus one that is offshore. We've got some metrics on a later slide. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then documentation cost. If you're looking at agile models, this is sort of the running joke with some of our colleagues, that agile is a low documentation methodology, which really isn't the intent of agile, by the way. It's intended to be a more rapid paced delivery methodology with staged releases as opposed to low documentation. But the demand for documentation in a domestic model is a little bit lower because the communication is a little more fluid and can be more verbal rather than primarily written. So some big components that you need to consider when you're developing a value proposition. We've begun to put together a model with a consortium of CIOs and senior executives from business that is intended to create some metrics that our clients and potentially other Outsourcing Institute members could leverage in trying to create their own value proposition. But here are some of the metrics that we've started to percolate. The cost of labor in a domestic solution center, and I think I'm a little more aggressive than Amarita. I think she said 20 to 30%. We're actually seeing in a well-chosen market, you can get labor rates down by almost 50% in a based balanced against a major metropolitan marketplace. It's still, again, higher than the offshore rates. The resource mix, you can much more easily do a resource mix that's more heavily balanced towards a remote location. We think it's at least 20 to 30% lower as far as localized resources, which tend to be more expensive rather than domestic location resources. Additional internal effort, it depends on the company, depends on the level of complexity to the work, and it also depends on the phase of the project that you're focused on. But from a requirements perspective, it's probably at least 20% more effort. There's some anecdotal evidence that in other phases of the development life cycle, it can be 50 to 75% more work, depending on the particular phase of the project that you're in. And then rework, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but there is the potential to have significant rework. We've got clients that would tell us, or have told us, that oftentimes they have to do things twice, which is obviously an inefficiency. I think the other two metrics we've spoken about already. Travel cost is going to be higher, and that's based on the cost of the trip. An average trip to India or China is going to be $5,000 to $10,000. Average trip to domestic locations, $1,000 to $2,000. So you have actual travel cost savings, but more importantly, probably, you have time savings in travel. If you take a long distance trip overseas, you're going to stay there 1 to 2 weeks. It's relatively simple if you need to get to the local development center to hop on a plane and do a 1 or 2 day round trip, almost no matter what the location is within the continental U.S. Next slide. Another key thing to consider is what types of work are really going to be the most beneficial and make the most sense in a domestic model. Certainly, in our view, there's no real replacement for offshore. That's a model that's going to stay. There's huge value in it. For certain types of work, it makes absolutely the most sense because of the cost profile. Labor arbitrage is real, and we absolutely think there's a fit in the marketplace. But there are certain types of work and certain factors to consider that may make it more attractive, or at least equally attractive, to do work in a domestic setting. If you look at the business user interaction, if it's high or medium interaction, that's definitely a telling sign that a domestic solution would likely be a good one to consider. If technical complexity, which usually means technical collaboration, ends up being high to medium, and you need to have a heavily integrated architecture effort, that's certainly something that you would potentially lean towards a domestic solution. If you're using Agile, sort of the methodology of the moment, which heavily depends on daily stand-ups and frequency of releases and heavy interaction between business and technology teams, absolutely, if it's required or desired, you should look at a domestic solution. It's very challenging to do this in a long-distance model. If the level of integration to other applications is high or medium. If outsourcing maturity is anywhere along the spectrum, but certainly if your outsourcing maturity is low, then using a domestic model may be an easy sort of toe in the water, because it feels much more like developing with folks who are part of the same organization as opposed to folks who are part of a very different organization. If your work focus is development or complex testing, maybe a little less support, it's certainly applicable, but certainly development and testing are a highly applicable model, certainly the complex testing scenarios. Time criticality is a big factor. Speed to market is a hallmark of a domestic solution. If you don't have a lot of available employee time, your employees are already tasked heavily with other things within the organization, and you need to lower the burden on them. One of the things it's not really good at, and Amarita actually identified this in her slides, is scale. Offshore is much better at large-scale initiatives. Domestic sourcing still tends to the medium or low-scale initiatives. So things that are under 100 people tend to be a better fit for an onshore solution. If you're dealing with older technology, there's still a strong knowledge base in many markets in the U.S. that is well-heeled in mainframe and other older technologies. That's a very good fit for a domestic solution. What's not a good fit is repeatable work. Mundane is probably a bad term. But repeatable work is probably not a good fit for a domestic solution because you can come up with a much lower cost model in an alternative solution. I think you'd sort of be wasting some of the potential of domestic sourcing. And if business knowledge is a requirement, that's also an area where leveraging onshore resources is potentially hugely beneficial. There are pockets of industry in the U.S. that happen to have fallen into low-cost marketplaces, like insurance is one, where you can find very strong industry knowledge coupled with technology capability and still be in a low-cost market. So these are some of the things to consider that might drive you towards a domestic sourcing solution. So the optimal types of work, and we're focused very heavily on IT, obviously, in this conversation. Application development integration, certainly for complex applications with quick time-to-market requirements. Application testing, and I would tend to say more complex application testing. Certainly what you'd call white box or gray box testing was actually some feedback to the development teams, not just walking through test scenarios. And also UAT, where there's a heavy business involvement, are all good applications of testing models that leverage domestic sourcing. Application support, level 1 and level 2, probably not the best fit, but certainly level 3 where it's more complex application support, another good fit for the model. When you look at the marketplace, there really are 3 different types of providers. And the market is growing and evolving, but these models seem to have become prevalent in the market. You've got the domestic remote provider. So a solutions provider that is entirely located in a remote location. They have no real local presence. They either leverage another firm for local presence or leverage your IT organization for the local presence. There are several providers that are strictly remote location-based providers. A lot of them are located in rural locations as opposed to tier 2 cities or tier 2 metropolitan areas. They're a good fit for work that's easy to off-site. And they tend to come at the model from more of a low-cost provider perspective than anything else. So their pitch is, we can reduce significantly your costs in a domestic model versus an offshore model. There's then the sort of domestic local / remote provider. So you've got a consulting firm or an IT services firm that's in your local marketplace that has started leveraging a domestic model to reduce their costs. So their intent is to create a complete continuum of service, but provide the lower cost option for doing some of the work like the development work, the testing work, and the support work. Then there are the major outsourcers, we talked about this earlier, who are all bringing forward their domestic model. It's sort of a complete the picture perspective that they're taking on, and their real focus is that they want to be able to provide you a complete spectrum of solutions, including this, but this is not necessarily the focus of their entire offering. It's really to complete their offering set. So those are 3 different models to think about. Depending on your scale requirements, depending on the complexity of your IT environment, you may consider different types of providers to be the adjunct to your particular service portfolio needs. So what are the key factors to consider? And again, Rita covered some of these nicely, so I'm not going to try to retrace a lot of her steps. But cost of living is really the driver. Cost of living drives cost of resource, right? Cost of actually hiring the people that you need in order to get the work done. That's certainly a primary factor in choosing any location, but available labor pool is second and of equal importance, really, or close behind. Because if there aren't enough people there with the right skills in order to meet your demands, you're not going to be successful in that marketplace. Educational support is also very, very important because you're not just building one generation of IT professional. You actually have to have an ongoing pipeline of folks who you can actually bring into your environment. So if there aren't good higher educational infrastructure capabilities, if the secondary school system isn't geared towards bringing people through that higher educational infrastructure, you're not going to be able to develop the next generation of IT professional. Also economic trends. A lot of people forget about this one, but folks point at Florida all the time. I hate to use a state as an example, and say that's a great location for this type of domestic sourcing. The challenge with areas like that, though, that were significantly economic boom locations 5 years ago, and today may have suffered from some economic fallback, is 5 years from now they could also be an economic boom. So you really need to consider the trend of the economy, not just the moment, the sort of current instance of the economy. I'm ready to cover the infrastructure. That's keenly important. Facility availability and communications availability, power availability. Those are key to putting up a durable center. Community enthusiasm in sport cannot be undersold. Having an area that really wants to embrace a new business and sees the opportunity and the value of that new business, creating high-value jobs in that market, not only gives you access to funding, which most communities have some funding available, it also creates the excitement that you need in the marketplace to keep new people coming in and gain those first employees that are important for success. And also availability of local leadership, right? Having the ongoing support of local leadership, local political leadership, and business leadership is key to success, because you're starting a new venture. You don't want to do it on your own. Next slide, please. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I see we're running a little bit late. I'll cover these a little bit more lightly. Process is key. So in the offshore model, the big win for them was declaring repeatable process, CMM levels 1 through 5, and be able to create clear evidence that they had a repeatable process. That is equally important in a domestic solution center. Whether or not you use a CMM metric, certainly having repeatable and flexible processes are key. Flexibility is unique, I think, in this model, in that it doesn't have to be as rigid and shouldn't be as rigid. You're actually able to broaden the offering set pretty widely in a domestic center in comparison, in some cases, to offshore, which focus on volume. There's both processes for executing projects as well as operational processes that need to be considered, and you really need to consider the work breakdown structure, because when you're dealing with a new workforce or a junior workforce or workforce that's not necessarily directly aligned to the major metropolitan area technologies, you have to think about the work differently. We have absolutely found that training is paramount to success. Most of the areas that you're going to look at that have the right financial profile don't necessarily have ready resources for you to take advantage of. They'll have some skills that are more senior, but you're going to be heavily dependent on college hiring, which means you're really going to have to look at either your initiative, or if you're using a third party, an outsourcer, you're going to need to look at their ability to train resources. You should really investigate their dedication to training. It is expensive, but it's critically important in order to be successful in a domestic location where you don't have that sort of ready pool of resources you do in a major metropolitan area. So if you look beyond the benefit to the company, there are significant benefits outside the business benefits. We certainly at Collaborative and a lot of our clients that have begun to consider this model really believe that there is a huge value in rebuilding local economies, right? Rebuilding within the United States areas that have suffered economic downturns and high unemployment. Also, revitalizing technology as a career path. A lot of us have grown up through IT. We have IT backgrounds. We've been IT professionals our whole career. If you look at the next generation of IT professionals, it's hard to see where they're going to come from. And in order to get to the point where they can manage these efforts, whether they're onshore or offshore, they need to actually have grown up through technology. So revitalizing that as a career path is important for U.S. IT organizations' success in the long term. You have to create the next generation of technologists. Also strengthening our colleges and university systems. IT as a career path has fallen way behind in colleges and universities. This is proven already in the small markets we're in to revitalize that and create new enthusiasm and new curriculum, better curriculum in colleges and universities. And also there's sort of a bit of a sort of a made in the USA pride here. I think that's an additional significant side benefit to going down this path and creating a domestic sourcing solution. And last but not least, very quick overview. So obviously, collaborative consulting is involved in this marketplace. We're huge believers. We're a U.S. consulting firm, primarily based in the Northeast, but with offices across the country, that has a domestic solutions center located in Wausau, Wisconsin. And we are already seeing the benefits to our clients of delivering under this model, where they get the advantage of collaborative consulting skills and capabilities in both industry and technology, but also can take advantage of a low-cost model that leverages U.S.-based workforce that brings tremendous value. So, I guess in conclusion, Amrita, I turn it back over to you.
Sure. Yes, we're going to go ahead. Thank you so much, John. We're going to go ahead and we already have some questions coming in, so we're going to go ahead and take some of those. And I just want to invite the rest of you to please send your questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. And if we don't get to some, we will definitely have someone from Collaborative respond to these questions and get in touch with you. So I'll go ahead with the first couple, which I think would be great to get your feedback on, John. One is domestic sourcing often requires fewer resources as well, right? The communication change for offshoring requires more people to be involved, which is part of the hidden cost of outsourcing. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have one client right now that we're working with, and we're looking at about a 35% reduction in overall resource requirements to accomplish with a domestic sourcing solution the same work that they were doing in an outsourced model. So there's absolutely some resource savings. And also, they've got to dedicate fewer resources on their side to managing and overseeing the effort. So in both internal IT as well as the outsourcing model, there are fewer resources required in order to get the work done.
Great, thank you, John. Another question is do you believe, so it's kind of a more general kind of impact to the United States workforce question, but do you believe that offshoring work to other countries has had a direct negative correlation to employment levels in the U.S.? And if so, do you think that there will be a wave of protectionism coming from state and federal government?
So I guess first, those are two very different questions,
Yeah.
sort of all wrapped up into one. First, let me take on has it had a negative impact on U.S. employment levels? I think it's had a negative impact on U.S. IT employment levels. If you look at most major IT shops where they may have had, hundreds of people in the U.S., a lot of them have either mandated or economically felt it was more viable to push that work to other globally distributed locations. And that absolutely has shrunk a number of IT shops, certainly has changed the face of the IT outsourcing industry entirely. So yes, I think that there has been a significant reduction in the amount of available jobs in the U.S. that are IT-centric. And you can see it in the higher education enrollment. Back in the late 90s in the U.S., we graduated over 20,000 people from college in IT careers. The latest metrics I saw from about a year or two ago, we're graduating about 12,000 people per year into IT career paths. So absolutely a negative impact. I hope there's not a wave of protectionism coming. I think what we need to do as an industry and a country is prove our value again, right? Prove it to ourselves, prove it to the world, right? We shouldn't be in the, I don't personally, I guess that's personal opinion here, I don't know that we should be in the business of putting up barriers artificially. I think the value proposition is strong for using a domestic provider. We certainly need offshore resources. We couldn't ever meet the demand with entirely U.S.-based resources, not in today's marketplace. But we certainly can grow that career path back to the optimal, or not even optimal, the significant levels that it was back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I would completely, I would very much agree with John and say that, I think that I'd say that, during the early 2000s when there was a lot more discussion on protectionism, the domestic sourcing companies that were around really didn't take off And because, when it comes down to it, businesses are going to look for true value proposition. And you see that in the last few years, the domestic sourcing companies are doing extremely well, and there's been a significant increase in growth in them, and it's because they are offering value versus before, or versus just having it be about kind of protecting U.S. jobs. So I think, if we can do that, and I think companies are doing that now, proving that value proposition, then that's going to be the best thing for the industry in the U.S. Let me take a couple more. Maybe I'll take this one, John, and you can kind of comment on it. We're in a highly offshore model, but we're finding suppliers that are increasing their presence of their offshore folks onshore, resulting in higher unit cost. Are you seeing this trend in companies? Absolutely seeing this trend in companies, and there's a couple reasons for it. One is that a lot of the offshore companies are trying to get into quote unquote higher value added work, and therefore when you are doing work that requires more direction or higher end, where you're actually helping to architect or coming up with the business case, etc., it's going to require more interaction, and therefore you're going to need more onshore people. So that's one of the reasons. The other is, of course, just that it's getting more and more difficult to get visas, and there's visa restrictions. And so whereas before they were flying people in and out, now that's becoming much more difficult. Therefore, they have decided to take the path of hiring, so part of it is good. They're hiring in the U.S. or they're hiring in the U.S. or bringing in kind of U.S. people to do those positions. So, either way, the costs are going up because of that. And you are seeing that trend. I don't think if you look now compared to 10 years ago, also the rates that the rates between an offshore provider and an onshore provider for when you're on site are virtually the same, whereas they were different 10 years ago. So you are seeing a rising cost overall when you're running a global sourcing model. And John, I don't know if anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a Trojan horse in there that some people have been sort of tripped up a little bit by, and that when they are still, some of the offshore providers are bringing folks onshore and then calling it sort of domestic sourcing. So you got to be a little careful in looking at the way they're establishing their domestic sourcing capability. If they're truly hiring U.S. resources, that's the model that you're going to yield the most benefit from. If they're merely locating offshore resources onshore, you lose some significant components to the benefit of domestic sourcing.
Let me look. I'm just kind of going through these questions. Thank you so much. We have some great questions, I know. Arlene, just let me know how many more we can take. Do rural destinations have current locations built to start work, or do they need time to build their infrastructure to meet client requirements?
We've done, I'll take this, Marita, you're
yes,
the location analysis expert. I'll take it first, but I'll be brief because you probably have more insight than I do. We've actually done a lot of research when we chose our first location and now are looking for a second location into potential places in the U.S. that have appropriate infrastructure. There are a lot of places that actually have more than adequate infrastructure for locating a center in the 1 to 200 person range. I think if your requirement is much more significant than that, you have to be a lot more fussy about the places that you want to locate. But you will find that there are buildings, facilities, infrastructure, appropriate power and internet connectivity that will meet most of the demands of a small to medium-sized center. You just have to make sure you use that as part of your evaluation criteria.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would say yeah, I would agree. But I do see differences that unfortunately just have to be kind of investigated. There are some rural locations where we've gone that have just very aggressive, have great infrastructure. By the way, now I don't think is as much of an issue. Broadband capability, because of the broadband initiatives from the federal government. Et cetera. Those, I think, infrastructure itself, in terms of power, and internet is not an issue anymore in most locations in the U.S. Availability of real estate, it does really vary, though. I would say there were some places we've been to where you wouldn't be able to you could build or get a 100 or 200 person center, but you wouldn't be able to just find it available. And so, and this, it's just, you know, there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it or path. It's just some have them and some don't. And a lot of it, you know, sometimes you go into a place where, you know, some major company just shut down or something, and there's just this great, you know, building, and that fueled getting another company in. So that does tend to have to be looked at kind of on a one-on-one, you know, unfortunately, kind of just going out to the place and seeing if they have it. And some places we found have been amazing at actually helping you do that. And most of the city and local governments, you know, who care about job creation, you know, care about this industry are really good about helping companies on that front.
Yep.
So,
I would agree.
okay. This is a question, I think, definitely a question for you. John, what are you seeing in regards to virtual workforce utilization? So I think, and maybe about the question, but I think really looking at, you know, I guess how the utilization would compare just being virtual versus, you know, versus being on site and in an office. I'm hoping I'm reading the question correctly.
Yep. We're seeing more and more virtualization of workforce. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons that this domestic sourcing strategy seems to be taking hold as people are more and more comfortable with work-at-home models, with work-remote models. The keys to success for this are a company's willingness to not have a workforce sitting down the hall. And if they're already comfortable in a model where you've got some work-from-home folks, then the model is very sort of adaptable. One of the challenges with remote models or virtual models are if you have an inexperienced workforce, it's very difficult to have someone who's fresh out of college work from home. They need to have mentorship, oversight, and guidance. So when we establish our centers, and I would recommend this for anybody who's setting up a domestic solution center, you need to be able to co-locate your resources in order to grow the IT population effectively. At some point, you can then infuse a virtual model when you have more experienced workers, but certainly initially that oversight and that growth is key to success. But yeah, absolutely, we see more and more of our clients going to a virtualized model.
Okay, great. I think, Arlene, can you let me know, should we take
You could take one more question, Amrita, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Okay, so this one might be a little bit, this one. What is I think this one is going to kind of be a depends answer, so I want to make sure we can answer your question. But what is the uptime for creating an onshore solution for a call center, for example? So I think it's an onshore solution, and not necessarily developing a center. I don't know, John, if you want to try to take this. I think when you're doing onshore call centers and you're outsourcing, the lead time for actually creating it is going to be very short. There's plenty of very good providers available. I think if you're setting up your own location, of course, it just depends, of course, how large or how big and how much kind of research you want to do in terms of your location. And I think just like setting up a location anywhere for a company, assuming you're doing kind of a large scale or your mid-sized to large company, 200 to 300 center, you know, would probably take you 6 months to a year. John, would you agree?
Yeah, I would say in the IT space, it's two very different answers depending on whether you're doing it yourself or you're engaging. Yeah. It's very quick to engage with a domestic solutions provider. The engagement models are pretty established and pretty flexible. I know that in our case, you know, within a few weeks, we can have a project up and running for a client, assuming that we have the demand, the available capacity in the center. If you're setting it up yourself, it's quicker. From my experience, it's quicker than doing it offshore, where we're really establishing the process and the facility, you know, could take 18 months or more. I'd say you still could have it up and running within 6 months.
Okay. Great. Okay, thanks, John. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We've had a couple requests. Arlene is going to, for the presentation, and I know that it is going to be posted. Arlene, can you give the details on that?
Sure. In approximately 2 days, everyone will be receiving a follow-up letter, which will include a link where you'll be able to find the recorded webinar from today, as well as the presentation slides. Also, within the letter, will include both Amrita's and John's contact information.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. If there is nothing else, I'd like to just conclude this webinar, and I'd like to thank Collaborative Consulting for sponsoring this webinar on this really very important topic, and Outsourcing Institute, of course, and Arlene for doing a great job organizing the webinar as usual. So,
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to thank you both as well, both the Outsourcing Institute and yourself, Amrita, for working with us on this, we think is really exciting initiative and webinar.
Great, thank you. So
Thank
thanks,
you.
everyone. Have a good day.